Truth Espresso, episode 362.
In a world gone bonkers.
It is not, generally speaking, unruly, but fires have been started and...
Where the culture is a dumpster fire.
We're coming for your children.
And churches have lost their way.
I am really uncomfortable with the story of the crucifixion.
It's time to wake up with Truth Espresso.
Truth Espresso.
Your weekly shot of truth. And now your host, Daniel Minnick.
Well, hello there, friends, family, foes, and of course, lurkers alike. This is Daniel Minnick, the host for yet another exciting episode of Truth Espresso. And yes, I had a hiatus last week, didn't have an episode last week. We had kind of a busy week that I didn't feel like I'd be able to fit in an episode, but you know, sometimes you gotta be able to take a break from some things so that you come back stronger and refreshed to continue doing what you're always doing. And so I hope that you enjoyed your hiatus from a new episode of Truth Espresso, but now we're back, and this episode I've entitled The Right Habit. Now, the word right being W-R-I-T-E, not R-I-G-H-T. But of course, I'm asking, is the right habit, right as in right words, also the right habit, R-I-G-H-T, the correct habit? And maybe this episode might inspire you if you desire to be a writer and you don't know how to go about that, and you wonder how people will put well-crafted opinion pieces in your favorite newspaper or magazine, and you think that they have this gift that you were not born with, and so you have no hope of doing something like that, you think anyway, but I hope that this episode might encourage you to rethink that and see that maybe you might have a path to being a writer, as this is also a path that I am kind of exploring in the last few months and trying to develop a bit of a habit for it. And yes, Truth Espresso, the podcast, is also a habit. I'm not going to replace Truth Espresso with writing, but I'm looking for finding some minutes to rub together and get used to writing, because writing is good for the brain. Writing is good for knowledge because it also encourages you to read. And because there's so much news happening right now, it would be impossible to cover it all in episodes of Truth Espresso. There's the Israel-Hamas peace deal, and then there's the government shutdown, also known as the Schumer shutdown, and of course the sombrero memes that have gone along with it. And you have President Trump restoring Columbus Day from the self-proclaimed decolonizers. And there's the scandal with Virginia candidate for Attorney General Jay Jones and his violent rhetoric. There's also Virginia candidate for Governor Abigail Spanberger and some of the things that she has said and people who have supported her that shows that she is a far left ideologue. We'll see how that race goes in Virginia. There's Katie Porter running for governor of California, who recently melted down during an interview and refused to answer basic questions about how to win voters and forcefully ended the interview. So yeah, there's a lot going on there, and I would love to be able to make Truth Espresso episodes about everything that's going on, but there's just too much. And so on some things, I would find a way to write about them, write about various topics, some things that are currently newsworthy, some things that are what are called evergreen. They're more like just general topics that don't depend on the news cycle. But whatever the case, I'm trying to find more time to write, even as I also have a full-time job and, parent with 4 kids with my wife. And she also runs a women's health clinic, and we got a lot of time going with that. And so, yes, we got pretty busy lives, but when you have a busy life, sometimes you realize just how valuable minutes are and how you can find ways to make some minutes even more valuable. And so this episode, I like to say that anyone who's literate can learn to write. Now, obviously, you have to be literate to write, and you have to understand language to write. But if you can talk, you can write. That's pretty much what I want to say there. Writing is a skill. It is not a gift. We see a lot of amazing writing. We might have favorite authors. We like to read their books, and they have a way with words. But I would like to say that's not something that someone is born with. Now, someone might have a natural talent to finding ways with words, but most of it is skill, not talent or gift. Because you had to learn how to write at the basic level as you went to school. You had to learn vocabulary, and you might still be learning vocabulary throughout your whole life. And so taking things that you learn naturally and fine-tuning them is the skill, not the gift of writing. And so before I get into just kind of showing some of the recent short writings, articles, letters to the editor that I've had published that I haven't really talked about on Truthspresso, but I've done in the last few weeks, I want to talk about how to write well. So how do you go about that? Well, the first step is write. Yes, you have to write before you can write well. And one of the most important steps to writing well is to write. Your invisible, polished article or story that sits in your imagination is no match for something that's actually well written. And so if you want to write well, you got to just start writing. Don't wait to be well to write. And to write well means that you should write concisely and to the point. In other words, there should not be a lot of fluff in what you write. Every word should matter, and that might scare you to think about it. Well, I'm not a wordsmith. I can't just sit there and write word for word that just sings on the page. Well, I'm going to explain briefly how you get to something where words sing from the page, and it doesn't start by writing it one after the other until you're finished. Good writing, as I said, is concise and to the point, and that's harder than it seems, but I will show you how you can do that. And writing well, also, number 3, is where you use smaller words and mostly shorter sentences. If you're thinking about writing well, you might be tempted, as I was in the past, to think that it's academic writing. Like if you write in such a way that makes yourself sound intelligent, where you're using big words and longer, complex sentences, that somehow that's good writing. Well, I learned the hard way years ago in a writing conference that that's not how to write well. Good writing is concise and to the point, and it uses mostly smaller words and shorter sentences. So, you might say, but Daniel, when I go to try to write, I have something on my mind, but I sit in front of the screen and I see a blinking cursor. I have what's called writer's block. And yes, every writer does suffer from writer's block, but you can minimize writer's block. If you find yourself staring at a blank page or blank Word document with that flashing cursor taunting you pitifully, well, first of all, realize that writer's block is pretty much a myth. I mean, is there such a thing as talker's block? You might know how to talk. You can have a conversation with someone, and there you're using words and sentences. You have talked with people about ideas that you're passionate about. So if you can talk, as I said before, you can write. And the problem is when we sit in front of our computer or our writing pad and we're not getting words out, and we call that writer's block, well, it's because our brain is playing tricks on us, and we can overcome that. And I am going to explain how to do that right now. Realize that your brain has two functions when it comes to writing. One of them is basically talking. And, when we talk, we don't necessarily talk in well-polished sentences. We can be wordy, we can stutter. We don't necessarily have a flourish when we talk. But that's one of our brain's functions, talking, getting out stuff that's in our head. And then the other function is editing. Now, when our brains are wanting to do both at the same time, that's writer's block. It's when we sit in front of the screen because we're expecting a well-polished sentence to come out word by word, one word after the other. We're letting those two functions be at war with each other. Why is that? Because they are at war with each other naturally. And so to overcome what we call writer's block, we have to learn to separate out those two functions. What we want to do is our talking function first, and then go back and do our editing function later. So think of writing like how a painter or a sculptor works on a piece of art. Now, I'm not a painter or a sculptor, but you know some basic concepts for how they get a finished work. That beautiful painting didn't happen 1 square inch at a time. The artist didn't take the brush and paint all the details in 1 square inch and then go on to the next square inch. It started with the artist lightly sketching basic shapes on the canvas with a pencil and then erasing some parts and redrawing them to get more defined lines. And then the painter paints some basic colors and then eventually tops those with some other colors. And sometimes there's shades of the color underneath and eventually to add depth. So we start with something that's rough, and then the painter adds details and fine-tunes it until he has a masterpiece. That stone sculpture wasn't cut in detail from top to bottom. It started with a large block of stone, and then the sculptor cuts chunks out of it until there are basic shapes. And then the sculptor cuts and cuts around the basic shapes until there's more and more detail. And he doesn't make the hair on the head of the sculptor in detail first and then works his way down. No, the sculptor adds detail holistically. The detail happens gradually around the whole structure. That's how art works. It's the same thing with writing, because writing is an art like painting and sculpting. You need to start with a large mass of something that you can work on until you fine-tune it into a masterpiece. And that's how, when we write, we want to separate out the two functions of our brain. The first one is the one that just gets out information. It's not pretty, but it's out there. And this is the mass of bleh that we start with. And then we follow that up with our editing function that will then fine-tune it. So start with that writing or talking, writing the rough draft. Get the ideas out of your head onto paper. Write down something how you would talk. Just start dumping stuff out. That cursor is sitting there flashing because you're trying to have a well-polished sentence and you want to start it word by word. That's writer's block. We're going to destroy writer's block for good. Just start writing out your ideas. Type words, type phrases, type some sentences that sound like the way you talk. Just get it out of your head. and get used to just typing out words, even if they don't make perfectly good sense. You might even allow yourself to misspell some words and just keep going. Just talk it out on the page. Just like you're having a conversation with someone. Imagine yourself trying to talk to someone about something that's on your mind. Just type that out. Just write it out. It may not be pretty, but that's how you start writing. You're going to basically vomit on the page or on the screen. And I'm choosing words like vomit intentionally so that you get comfortable with the idea that when you're starting this rough draft, it might be word vomit. It doesn't matter. Words on the page or on the screen are better than no words. Information that's in your head out on the page or on the screen is better than it staying in your head and you possibly forget about it. It doesn't matter how bad it looks. You want that information recorded before you forget about it. And as I said, type just words or phrases as needed. If as you're typing something, doing this rough draft, not thinking about full sentences or polished sentences, but just puking things out, you might actually think of something that you need to cover, even if you're typing a sentence or you need to quick finish up a sentence. Carriage return, press enter, type out a few of the words that you just thought of, ideas you need to cover, just get that in there, puke it out. And then once you have a mass of blech, that's your rough draft that you've gotten out of your head, dumped mindlessly pretty much onto the page or onto your computer screen, then you can start the work of editing.
The Christian podcast community is a cohesive group of like-minded Christian podcasters proclaiming the truths of Christ with expertise and passion in the areas of theology, church history, Christian living, evangelism, apologetics, parenting, homeschooling, sermons, and much, much more. So check us out at ChristianPodcastCommunity.org. ChristianPodcastCommunity.org. One stop for all your favorite Christian podcasts.
As I said, separating these brain functions, you want to avoid the temptation of editing while you're writing because you'll find yourself in writer's block before you know it. You'll find your brain getting exhausted trying to do two different functions that are at war with each other, and you'll give up. We don't want to give up. We want to write here. So editing, do minimally while writing, if at all. Try to avoid doing editing at the same time as writing. Seriously, I can't emphasize this enough. You will find yourself in writer's block before you know it. Now, you could go back to the top of your rough draft after you've barfed it out, but it might be best to wait some time. Now, that time could be 15 minutes. Maybe you need to go grab a snack or do something, throw some laundry in the wash, go make yourself a fresh cup of coffee, whatever it is. Just a few minutes away might be enough time to refresh your brain a bit. 15 minutes, an hour, or maybe even wait to the next day before going back and looking at your draft again, because you will return with a fresh set of eyes. And then you will be able to find things that need some editing. And now when it comes to editing, I would encourage you to consider editing multiple times, multiple different times. Editing is where you take a hacksaw to your draft And don't feel bad. You will get used to the idea of editing, and you will get used to the idea that you started with an amorphous blob of vomit, and then you're going to turn it into something beautiful through editing. Remember the rough pencil sketches that I mentioned in the painting with the ovals and rectangles? And remember the uncut block of stone? Your rough draft is naturally, rough and ugly, and it's a massive word vomit, and there's going to be some gems along the way because, as I said, when you're vomiting stuff out, sometimes your brain will remember, oh yeah, here's this cute little quote that I remember, I got to get that in there. Oh yeah, here's some ideas that I need to cover, and oh yeah, here's a little witty phrase, dump it out and get it there. Within your vomit, you will have some things, some gems that come out. So as you're editing, read each sentence and see if it's needed. And if the sentence is fluff that doesn't add anything useful to your whole piece, see if you could get rid of it and still have a paragraph that makes sense. Now, yes, initially when you're starting this process of being a writer, you might feel the pain when you erase a whole sentence. But trust me, this is important. It's important to be able to find sentences that are redundant. They repeat something essentially that you've already said before in another paragraph. Well, get rid of it. Unless there's one central point to your article that you say, at the beginning, and then you kind of repeat it after you've proved your point, then yeah, you could do that. But if you find in your draft that you have a bunch of fluff sentences that add nothing new and just keep repeating the same argument, you only need to say it once, erase the sentence, and see if you have a paragraph that still makes sense. If you still need part of the sentence, we'll see if you can chop off part of the sentence and have a shorter sentence. Or if you have a sentence that is unusually long, you might be able to cut it into 2 shorter sentences. This is one of the beneficial parts of editing, especially looking to make sure that things are readable. Long sentences can make the reader's brain get exhausted, and it might even make them stop reading your piece. You want every sentence to be short enough or to the point enough so that their brain doesn't get tired and that they continue to read your piece. Now, as you're editing and as you read each sentence in one of your several editing rounds, see if you can find any words that you can remove and still have a sentence that makes sense. So I mentioned getting rid of redundant sentences, and now when you feel like you don't have any unnecessary sentences, it might be time to go to each sentence and see if there's some words that don't have to be there. So see if you could remove some words and still have a sentence that makes sense, and you'll get used to finding those words. And chances are, as you're doing this, you'll find that you're getting rid of wordiness. Sometimes you could get rid of words like so or that. I did it so that I could. You could change that to I did it to whatever. And of course, replace larger jargon words that sound technical and overly academic with smaller words. For example, if your sentence is, the company manufactured a brand new widget, there are some edits we can do to this. You could say the company made a brand new widget. So that's much more readable than company manufactured a brand new widget. But what else could we edit here? Oh yeah, brand new. It's a little wordy. Just say new. So our new edited sentence is the company made a new widget. Now, isn't that much more readable than the longer sentence? It's easier for the human brain to digest shorter sentences where every word is readable and needed. And that's what we're going to do with editing. We polish a blob of blech into something that's beautiful, pungent, potent, concise, to the point. Every word is needed. Every word supports the point that you're making. And the whole piece is beautifully readable. So if you do several rounds of this type of editing, slashing sentences, slashing out unnecessary words, replacing longer, bigger words with shorter words that kind of mean the same thing, before you know it, you will have written a masterpiece. Now, in my busy life, I'm looking for time to develop a habit of writing short pieces. The same principle here definitely can apply to a full-length book, but I would recommend starting your writing by writing shorter pieces. If I find a topic in the news and I think of a unique angle to it, I could start puking out a rough draft of something that I want to say about it, and then I could go back and edit some more until I have a polished final draft where it seems that no word is out of place and it makes an important point or two. So when I'm talking about shorter pieces, I'm talking about blog posts, opinion essays, letters to the editor, that type of thing. I would recommend that if you want to be a writer, you think about opinion pieces. So a quick point about opinion pieces: newspapers, news sites, magazines usually have two ways to submit an opinion, and these are letters to the editor and op-eds. And I'll explain what an op-ed is. A letter to the editor is the smaller of these two. It's usually a response to a larger news item or an op-ed. Periodicals have different guidelines, but letters to the editor will usually be between 100 or 300 words. So this might amount to 2 to 4 paragraphs. If you want to get started with opinion writing, you might want to try a letter to the editor in a local newspaper. And it could be satisfying to see your letter show up on the newspaper's website and maybe even in print. Of course, look for the submission guidelines in the paper on the paper's website and follow them to a T. That is very important. Don't try to cut corners or go over the word limit. If they say 300 words, don't submit 305 words. Maybe even try to cut it down to where it's a little bit under 300 words. Vomit out your draft first and then edit it until it seems airtight. Yes, a short letter to the editor still is something that you want to puke out and then edit and polish until it's airtight. Now, the other type of opinion piece is an op-ed, and it's called that because newspapers used to have a page with editorials from staff writers, and then on the page opposite the editorial page were the opinion pieces from guests. Hence, op-ed, because it's opposite the editorial. Now, many newspapers are giving op-eds newer names. If you have read the New York Times, you might notice that it now calls them guest essays. So an op-ed or a guest essay is usually longer than a letter to the editor. Unlike a letter to the editor that responds to a news article or an opinion column, an op-ed is not a response to something else that's in the paper. It's a unique contribution. And an op-ed is longer, so it will usually be about 500 to 800 words. But again, check the submission guidelines and follow them to a T. And yeah, you might want to write your piece for the New York Times or the Washington Post. Who wouldn't? But I would recommend that you start smaller. Try a local newspaper or a lesser-known website and work your way up.
The good news is Striving for Eternity would love to come to your church to spend 2 days with your folks teaching them biblical hermeneutics. That's right, the art and science of interpreting Scripture. The bad news is somebody attending might be really upset to discover Jeremiah 29:11 should not be their life verse. To learn more, go to strivingforeternity.org to host a Bible interpretation made easy seminar in your area.
So now I want to get into briefly mentioning 4 pieces that I have written recently in the last few weeks, and how I am kind of trying to polish my writing for opinion pieces and trying to work my way up, as I said. So who knows, maybe in the next few weeks, the next few months, the next few years, I might get something published in a recognizable periodical. So we shall see, but yes, just letting you know that's my goal, is to try to work my way up so that I will increase an audience and build a writing portfolio or a writing resume. Because if I say that my works have showed up in this and this and this and this and this, people might take me seriously, and then I can build an audience from there. So I have 4 pieces that I have written. One of them is a letter to the editor, and the other 3 are opinion essays or op-eds. None of them are in the New York Times, okay? But the first one, I did pitch it to quite a few sources, and each time I pitched it to another source, of course, they had different submission guidelines, so I had to edit for that place. So by the time I got my piece submitted, after having edited it multiple times myself, and after having edited it multiple times for different places I pitched it to, I had edited it essentially more than a dozen times. And so, I hope that if you read it, you'll find it polished enough. So my first op-ed landed in The Thinking Conservative, and I'll provide a link to it in the show notes, and it's entitled, How Men Are Behind Abortion Culture and What They Should Do About It. So I've kind of had this passion about the idea that really men are responsible for promoting abortion, because a lot of the propaganda out there is that men in general are against abortion because they want to enslave women in the home with children, and that's how they control women, and that women in general want abortion because it makes them equal with men and they have more freedom and whatever. And so men are against abortion because they're misogynistic and women need to fight for their freedom. But I wrote this piece to show that throughout history into modern times, we can see a common theme that men have been responsible for pushing abortion, that men secretly like abortion. Now, I'm not talking about devoted Christians. I'm not saying, of course, that I like abortion. No, I am ardently against abortion, but of course not for the reasons that most abortion proponents seem to think. And so men in history have forced women to drink tonics to cover up things that they did and to kill the children so that they're not found out and so on. And they've risked health of women, poisoning women, making women do things that are harmful to them so that the men can get away with sins. And I also showed recent examples of men trying to spike women's drinks and food with abortion pills against the desires of these women to keep their children. And that shows this is not isolated. It's a very common type of thing. So I used all these examples to craft my argument. I talked about how men invented abortion devices to make the point that men, we need to realize why men encourage abortion, facilitate abortion, and then, as should often be the case, an opinion piece has kind of a concluding point or a call to action. So I say what they should do about it, and I tried to present the gospel in my piece here, that the gospel, with Jesus as the example, is the solution to this abortion culture that men are promoting. So I'll provide a link to that in the show notes if you want to go check it out and see the first example recently of my writing habit here. The next example is also on The Thinking Conservative, and it's entitled, There Is a Monster Under the Bed. It's Time to Make Fairy Tales Great Again. And this was after the murder of Irina Zarutska, the Ukrainian refugee woman who the criminal stabbed on the light rail in North Carolina. I was writing that before Charlie Kirk's assassination, but when then that happened, I decided to start rewriting my article to incorporate that. And the premise of this, because I encourage you to think of unique angles when you're writing an opinion piece, or especially if you can come up with a personal example. And in this case, I started it with kind of describing how one night my wife and I are tucking our girls into bed and singing them songs to get them to sleep, but they don't want to go to sleep because they're afraid there's a monster under the bed. And so I take that meme of them being afraid of a monster under the bed to show that, okay, it's kind of a childhood fear of monsters under the bed and boogeymen in the closet, but I bring that point closer to home with recent examples of political violence and criminals killing people like Irina there, where he sneaks up on her from behind, just like a fictitious monster would sneak up on a child, to show that, hey, we have a monster problem and we need to get rid of it. And I talked about a monster factory, so I had this interesting angle to show that adults, we need to realize that there are monsters under the bed and we need to make them fairy tales again by having a good criminal policy. And then my third thing that I got published recently was a letter to the editor in the Baptist Standard. This is a periodical and website that's from Texas. And being a Baptist, I thought it would be cool to get something published in a Baptist periodical. And I read some articles in the Baptist Standard. Two of them had to do with polls. One of them was a Gallup poll. One of them was a Barna poll showing how discernment in America, or even among Christians, about basic Christian doctrine is kind of at an all-time low. And so my letter to the editor was to show how disappointed I am in that and to explain what I think is the reason for that. And that is like that we don't have the right standard. We don't have the Word of God as a standard. We have cultural trends and things like that as the standard. And that's why people who are identify as Christians, or they're loose churchgoers, and they're letting the ivory tower of culture and cultural issues shape what they think is the truth and not the Word of God. And so that was my letter to the editor there, responding to only 2/3 of U.S. Christians believe all have sinned. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. And then finally, my fourth one is something that is on the Libertarian Christian Institute. Now, you might be thinking, Libertarian Christian? What is that? I thought libertarians were a bunch of people who only care about weed and wearing grungy clothes and having colored hair and piercings and weird fetishes, and they just want to be able to do whatever they want to do. Yeah, there are plenty of people like that out there that call themselves libertarian. But in general, you can find some clean people in that might be called libertarian that just have a certain philosophy about the role of government. So there's a difference between libertine and libertarian. I'm not a member of the Libertarian Party. I never have been. I'm not endorsing anything that anyone who might call himself a libertarian has said or written. There's plenty of stuff I would have strong disagreements with, but one of the things I do like that's in the libertarian movement is usually they have the best understanding of free market economics and of the role of government and how government nannyism destroys an economy. So there is a well-known, at least in libertarian circles, French economist from the 1800s named Frederick Bastiat. He wrote a piece called The Law, but he also wrote a piece called What is Seen and What is Not Seen, and he presented what's called the broken window fallacy. I explain what Bastiat wrote in my article, and I apply it to something that we don't normally, at least economists don't normally think of this, but my piece was called Abortion and Bastiat's Seen and Unseen. So Frederick Bastiat encourages economists when, say, the government proposes something like this spending project, we'll build a new bridge, and wouldn't that be great? Because if we don't spend money on this, a bridge won't be built. So if we spend money to build a bridge, that's a net gain for the economy. But free market economists will understand, well, if you don't take the money from people to buy this bridge, where else could it have been spent? And it might have been spent on something better in a more free market system rather than confiscated from the people. And so there are these unseen things, these things that are like what ifs, or these things like you don't really see who you're impacting because all you're seeing is here's the money and here's what I'm using it for. So I take that analysis and I apply it to abortion. Like when someone says, my body, my choice, all we're focusing on is the seen. What is seen is, oh, there's an unexpected pregnancy and there's, difficulty with it, and abortion is the apparent solution to that. But what is unseen is you're killing a child. People don't talk about that. There's also what benefit could that child have brought society if the abortion didn't happen, and so on. So I'm taking a classical economic argument and I'm applying it to abortion. So I'll provide a link to that in the show notes. And yeah, that's 4 things that I've published so far. And trust me, I have a lot more in the queue. I have things that I have been pitching elsewhere that have yet to be accepted. And so I might have some tricks up my sleeve to try to get in places that I never thought that I'd be able to get into, and we shall see. It's not in my power. It's in the power of those who would see my writing worthwhile, and I'm going to see if some of these next things that I'm going to pitch will find themselves moving up the ladder. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode of Truthspresso, and hey, maybe it will encourage you to reconsider writing as an art that you might have not thought possible for yourself, but now you're encouraged to realize, yes, you can write, and it's something that you can craft and fine-tune, and that you indeed can do when you separate out writing the draft from editing, and that you just need to go with the flow and vomit on the page. And that maybe this episode will be responsible for launching some writing careers, who knows? But hope that you enjoyed this episode. We're encouraged by it, and I hope that you might check out these linked opinion things that I've written, and that it might be, maybe even those would encourage you to write, or whatever the case. I hope that you might benefit from some of my opinions that I'm writing here, and that you look forward for more episodes of Truthspresso and more writings from me, and God bless.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Truthspresso. Be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast app. Truthspresso is a member of the Christian Podcast Community. Check out other great faith-building shows at ChristianPodcastCommunity.org.